to our summer form series. July is all about buyer forms. The next form that we are going to cover today is our increased deposit addendum. And this one also pairs with our, I should have specified our delivery of increased deposit, our DID form. So the IDA form and the DID form go together really nicely. We're going to cover both of those next. This increased deposit addendum. So in our residential purchase agreement, it used to have a spot for increased deposit where we would specify the terms of the increased deposit. It no longer gives us that opportunity. It gives us the opportunity to check that there is an increased deposit, and then it's going to add this car form IDA to it. Okay. And then these terms are going to be incorporated into the purchase agreement. Or if it was part of a counter offer, you would check the box and put counter offer there. Okay. And make sure you put that date, the full property address, buyer's names and seller's names. And just some for clarification, because I can't state this enough, when we put the full address in there, make sure you put street, court, drive, road, way, whatever it might be, because there could be same roads named the same thing, but one might be way versus court versus drive versus parkway. Okay, so we always want to make sure that we put 1, 2, 3 sample street. So we put that suffix on the end. All right, here's our increased deposit. Buyer agrees to deposit with escrow holder in the same manner as the initial deposit upon removal of all contingencies or on blank date or upon blank. So there's so many options there. So the default is, hey, after we remove contingencies, we're going to do this increased deposit. The second option for the or is on a specific date. So it might be, maybe my buyer is selling a vehicle and the sale is almost complete. And right now my buyer only has $10 to their name. So they're like, hey, we can give a deposit of $10. But in 3 days or 5 days or whatever that is, maybe they're waiting for a wire to hit their bank, right? So whatever that might be, maybe they're pulling money from their retirement account for the purchase. So they could say, hey, on today's the 17th, on the 25th, right? We're going to do that increased deposit amount. So it doesn't have to be removal of contingencies. You can use this for somebody who maybe doesn't have funds available today. They're waiting for a paycheck or a gift funds or something to that effect. Okay. The other option is or upon blank. So, right. So you could make that really be anything, whatever that might be. The sum of blank dollars, and you're going to fill that in here. So we're going to say, hey, we're going to give you your increased deposit in basically a week. In fact, we're going to make it a week. We're going to say it's on the 24th, which is a week, and it's going to be an increased deposit. I already have $100 on the original purchase contract. So this is where we would do our difference. Maybe our purchase contract is $600,000. We're trying to do a 1% deposit, but today my buyer only has $100. So we're short $5,900. So I'm just saying my increased deposit is going to be $5,900. Okay. So we're going to put what the increase is, not the total. Now on the next line, line number 2, the combined total of the initial deposit and the increased deposit shall be, and that's where we add those two numbers together. So in my example, I said they were doing $100. That's all they had today. But in a week, they'll have the rest of it. So we'll put that there. Okay. Or blank percent of the purchase price. Oops. It didn't like that at all. There we go. 1% of the purchase price. The percent is specified for calculation purposes. It is not a contractual term. Obviously, I don't have a purchase agreement filled out for it to do that. So there I'm saying, hey, we're doing that. Now remember, if we're agreeing to the liquidated damage clause, we don't want to go over 3% on our deposit because it's just a waste of energy and effort and it's fluff. Okay. And it might say to the seller that they are not really being honest because they don't even care what they put in there because we can only keep 3%. All right. So application of increased deposit to liquidated damage. If the parties agree to liquidated damage of this agreement, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit into the liquidated damage amount by signing a new liquidated damage clause, car form DID at time. Increased deposit is delivered to escrow, and then everybody's going to sign this. Okay, this is just specifying what our increased deposit is going to be in the terms for which it would be delivered. Now, I'm also going to clarify while we're talking about this form and the next form together that if on my purchase agreement, I specified that my deposit was $100 and the seller accepted that, and my buyer puts into escrow $10,000, the sellers don't have right to any amount of that money except for the deposit, which is $100, as long as we've agreed to that liquidated damage clause. Okay. The liquidated damage clause states that in case of the buyer's breach of contract, the buyer is in default of the contract and they cancel it out of breach, then the seller gets either the deposit or 3%, whichever's less. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind as well. I've had a couple questions recently about that, as far as like buyer gave extra money to escrow. Does all of that count towards the deposit? No, only what's specified on the purchase agreement counts towards that deposit amount. So buyers can at any time put more money into escrow, and that's just holding it there for closing. Doesn't go to the seller at any time. All right. So that's our IDA form. Any questions about the IDA form? All right, moving right along. Again, this couples well with this delivery of increased deposit form. So this one and the IDA, or the increased deposit addendum, go well together. This is not to be used at time of offer or counter offer. This form gets used when the deposit's actually made to escrow. Now, keep in mind that if my buyers have an increased deposit, let's say that our initial deposit is 1% of $6,000, right? So it's going to be, if it was $600,000 purchase price, that 1% is 6,000. And then we have an increased deposit of another percent for a total of 2%. My buyers on day one of that contract, once it's accepted, could put $12,000 into escrow, of which $6,000 is going to count towards the initial deposit. Once it comes time for the increased deposit, now we're going to submit this form over to my sellers. Title also gets a copy of this, and this says, hey, that other $6,000 that the buyers deposited already, now it's part of the deposit. But until we sign this form, it's not part of the deposit. It's just part of their down payment. It's just part of buyer's funds. Okay. Or buyer could just submit the original $100, right, upon accepted contract. And then when the time comes to put that extra $5,900 into the escrow account, then we pull out this form at that time. So the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement or other form or agreement. You're going to date it, property address, buyer's name, seller's names. Okay, by depositing on, okay, we're going to say, hey, this is the 24th. The sum of, now we're depositing that extra $5,900 we did, how they send those funds over, they wired them, right? Or, whatever it is. Buyer hereby increases the total deposit to, this is where we do that math again. We got to add them together for the total deposit. So the increase plus the original is the total deposit. Okay, so that's where now those funds are now incorporated in. We know they've been earmarked as part of the deposit. So number one always gets filled out with increased deposit. Okay, we're always going to fill out number one anytime we make that increased deposit, or the time comes for that increased deposit when the funds are already in escrow. Section 2 is if the buyer and seller have agreed to liquidate damages in the agreement, the following liquidated damage provision is hereby incorporated in and made part of this addendum. If they have not agreed to that on the purchase contract, neither party initialed that box. It was agreed on the counteroffer that we don't agree to the liquidated damage, right? Everybody has to be in agreement. We would check this box here. So if we're not agreeing to liquidated damage, we want to check this box. If we do agree, we leave it blank. The liquidated damage states that if buyer fails to complete the purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which the buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained should be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision, or arbitration award. By signing below, buyer and seller acknowledge that each has received a copy of this delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages addendum. Each has read, understands, and agrees to its terms, and then we're going to sign it there. If We don't do this in our office for the most part. In Northern California, they don't do it this way, but in other areas they might. Buyer has given additional deposit to broker who acknowledges receipt of the additional deposit. We would check it there. So if it goes to escrow, our broker instead of escrow, we would check that box and then broker would sign it. Again, that's not our common practice, but there are other areas where brokers hold those deposits. Okay. Any questions about the delivery of increased deposit, the DID form that couples with that IDA form? Okay, fabulous. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. Next week, we'll be back the same time. We'll be covering our cancellation of contract, our contingency removal for our buyers, our contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, and our notice to the seller to perform. As well as if you have any questions about other forms or buyer-related forms, you can always bring those questions to class as well, and I will answer those for you. And then at the end of the month, we are having our wonderful attorney back, Bob, talking about how to stay out of court. Again, those are always good classes. He always touches on something new and exciting that we may not have thought about and to be able to protect ourselves. So he'll be back at the end of the month. Any questions before we wrap up today? All right, everyone. Thanks for joining me and have a great day. We will see you next Thursday.
Thank you.